All right, you guys, welcome to the show. It's Anti-War Radio on Chaos 95.9 FM in Austin, Texas. I'm Scott Horton. We're streaming live, of course, at chaosradioaustin.org and at antiwar.com/radio. And we're going to go ahead and get the first show of the week started here with Patrick Cockburn. He's the award-winning Middle East correspondent for The Independent. That's independent.co.uk. And he's the author of the book Muqtada. Welcome back to the show, Patrick. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Well, I sure appreciate you joining us on the show today.
No, thank you.
All right, so let's see here. I guess we got to start with Iraq, although I mostly want to ask about Afghanistan today. The top headline at antiwar.com right now is that 127 people have been killed in a series of bombings around Baghdad today. White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs condemned the bombing but insisted that it proved the nation was moving in the right direction and that the attackers are threatened by that. So what do you think about that? 127 killed in multiple bombings, a sign of progress?
Well, it's sort of pressing when people say things like that. I remember the very first bombs in Baghdad in 2003 when the U.S. military spokesman and his civilian counterpart was saying this is the very last kick of the remnants of the supporters of Saddam and anti-Iraq forces. I mean, it's kind of nonsense then, and it's nonsense now.
Well, so what does it mean? I guess, would you say that this is the so-called Islamic State of Iraq that's probably behind these? And what exactly is that anyway?
That's the sort of the front, which is really al-Qaeda in Iraq, which doesn't really have much to do with Osama bin Laden. It's kind of their own group, and I assume it's them. They've done a series of bombings like this. We used to have bombings on an industrial scale in Baghdad. Now they've sort of refined their tactics. The target is still the same. It's mostly sort of poor Iraqi civilians, but their tactic is to have 5 or 6 big bombs that was let off within an hour in the center of the city, usually outside ministries or landmark buildings, also in crowded areas, so they kill and wound a lot of people. And the aim is to say to the government, which has been boasting about how security has improved, that no, it hasn't. We can hit you whenever we want to.
Well, and I guess there's sort of a lesson here about terrorism. If I understand how this works right, then basically the theory behind something like the series of attacks today, obviously a coordinated series of attacks today, would be to try to get the Shiite government, obviously mostly Shiite government, to overreact and crack down, and then that's supposed to help recruit more people to the resistance, right?
Sure, yeah, I think you've got it in one. That's the way terrorism really works, which is you tempt the government to overreact. That was al-Qaeda was, I think, in their own leaflets said this about 9/11, but it wouldn't have worked from their point of view unless they could have got the Bush administration to overreact and invade Afghanistan and Iraq. That's where their victory was. You need a government to dance to your tune, which of course Bush did. And it's still an open question as to how far that happens in Iraq. Al-Maliki, the prime minister, is obviously embarrassed by this, having made these, rather unwisely, these boasts about security being better. And this is the Shia government, so do they start sort of sending their troops into Sunni areas and arresting all the young men, which in Iraq usually means everybody gets tortured pretty badly, and then you get a mass reaction. So al-Qaeda may be hoping that that's what happens. Having said that, that's a lot of criticism for, not stopping these bombs and suicide bombers and people saying that the security forces must have been implicated. And that's not necessarily true. I mean, unfortunately, this kind of bomb in a city that's really crowded like Baghdad, packed full of vehicles, sidewalks packed full of people, it's quite, it's possible to get a bomb through, and when it does go off, it kills an awful lot of people.
So what about, I guess the news said the other day that they finally worked out a deal on the election to have it in January after all, although there had been all kind of disputes where I guess the Kurdish vice presidents kept vetoing the law that the parliament passed. They finally got that through. Do you think, we're still on track to have what we're supposed to be down to only 50,000 troops by this August? So it looked like that's still the timeline?
It's, March 6th is the date for the election. But, it's never been, somehow it's got a lot of publicity, but it's really not the case that the U.S. was, if the election was delayed a bit, the U.S. is going to delay, pull out. But it's two different processes. One, you have the election, and it isn't much to do with U.S. troops. U.S. troops are outside the cities now. And the U.S. withdrawal is under a status of forces agreement, which was signed by Bush just at the end of last year. I mean, you remember the famous incident when Bush was in Baghdad and he had the two shoes thrown at him.
Right.
Now, the reason he was in Baghdad was to sign this agreement withdrawing American forces. And that isn't going to be affected by, Iraqi elections. In fact, they're going to be on March the 6th anyway, so there is a date for them.
And so you're saying that even if they didn't have the election, if they hadn't been able to settle on that agreement for that election, then the Maliki government is still in a position either way to insist that America stick to the status of forces agreement.
Yeah, I mean, these guys have got a great big army. The U.S. forces are outside the cities. They doesn't really do them much good. And also the U.S., after all, Obama wants those troops for Afghanistan, so the U.S. doesn't necessarily want to keep them around.
Has there been any move toward the resolution of the status of Kirkuk, or have they just kicked that can down the road for now?
They kicked it down the road. I mean, there are different things that might happen, but basically nobody's going to agree. It's too big an issue. It's it's not just the city of Kirkuk; it's the oil fields near Kirkuk.
Right.
Who owns those? And what happens to the province of Kirkuk? This is a place that's very sort of divided between different ethnicities and religions. So that's been kicked down the road, and it seems to me one of those big problems in the world which is kind of insoluble.
Yeah, well, and speaking of insoluble and American occupations here, we have the Afghanistan war, and you referred to this a minute ago when we were talking about the strategy behind using terrorist tactics and provoking a reaction. You have a quote in your recent article here at the London Independent, U.S. surge will only prolong Afghan war, and the quote is of Ayman al-Zawahiri, saying that the purpose of the 9/11 attack was to get American ground troops in the Muslim world in, quote, a clear-cut jihad, or to create a situation where they can have a clear-cut jihad against the infidels. They thought, this is what Michael Scheuer has said for years and years, the way that Zawahiri always framed it was that America had been at war with them all along through their governments. And so now they wanted to get our troops on the ground within rifle range, basically try to keep them there as long as it takes to I guess, bankrupt the American empire and force us completely out of the region. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's dead on, I think. And Bush played right into their hands. Previously in the 1990s, they'd been sort of making attacks on governments which they saw as being dependent on the U.S., but these were sort of indigenous governments, in Egypt and other countries. They really wanted to fight it out toe-to-toe with the U.S. in Muslim countries, and so nobody was more delighted than they were when suddenly there were American armies in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think Scheuer says the whole purpose was to get us bogged down in Afghanistan. They thought they'd learned the lesson from the Russian war, that if they just fought hard enough and believed in God enough that they could bring down any superpower, and they wanted to replicate that. But that the Iraq war was the hoped for but unexpected gift. This was Osama bin Laden's Christmas present from George Bush.
Oh yeah, very much so. I think that's the mechanics of terrorism also, always, that the success is not some terrorist act. It's provoking an exaggerated counter-reaction. which you turn to your advantage. I mean, you need kind of a pretty dumb government on the other side to, as I said, dance to your tune to that degree. But
we got that.
Yeah, they seem to have got just what they wanted.
Yeah. Well, we'll
of
never.
course, also one should say, governments like the idea of having a successful small war. Governments, you can build your authority like that, not just in the United States, but in Russia. Why is Putin there? He was the man who sprang from obscurity as the man who fought and won the war in Chechnya. So it's always tempting, I think, throughout history for governments to think, aha, here we have a small successful war, which we can increase our own authority, we can win elections, if we don't have elections, it'll keep us in power for a long time. That's the temptation for a lot of governments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no point in getting in a war with a major power that can fight back. But if we can just occupy people indefinitely, it's on sort of the West Bank model.
You see some sort of, failed state like Iraq or Afghanistan or Somalia or Lebanon, and they're complete pushovers, In fact, these are some of the most dangerous places on the planet. But these guys aren't too smart, and they're thinking about staying in power themselves. They're not exactly experts on these places. So again and again, they fall into these traps.
Well, in Barack Obama's speech where he announced the Afghanistan escalation, at the end he said, we'll follow al-Qaeda wherever they go, and that includes Somalia and Yemen, he said at the end. And we know America's been intervening in Somalia for the past few years, but Yemen, that sounds to me like he's talking about combat forces actually operating, not just having a base, but actually fighting on the Arabian Peninsula. How many towers might that get knocked down?
Well, also just Yemen is not a place to fight. It's another place where, there isn't a strong central state. I know Yemen quite well. But, every village is, going to fight it out. You really don't want to be there. In the same way as Somalia, much of the time people there spend fighting each other. But the one thing that'll turn them around is to, if there's a foreign invasion or something that they think of as a foreign invasion.
Well, are there people in Yemen who are a threat to America?
Not at present, but they sure would be if a lot of Americans turn up,
Yeah. Well, when Osama bin Laden declared war back in 1996, the title of the thing was Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. And apparently, best I can tell from his rhetoric, he doesn't really say the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or anything. It's the Arabian Peninsula. All those British-drawn borders notwithstanding, that's the land of Mecca and Medina, and no white Christian army troops are welcome there, basically, right?
Sure, yeah. I mean, actually, bin Laden, I think his family is part Yemeni, but I think that these sort of these things that seem so easy, at the time, let's go into Somalia, let's go into Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, I don't remember the Marines getting blown up. It's funny, there's no sort of memory in Washington or indeed in London that, these much despised failed states are incredibly difficult to conquer. There's nobody on the other side to run up the white flag, just a lot of very dangerous people.
Right. Instead of, the model of World War II or something where, I guess, Berlin was completely occupied, but the Japanese, they met on a boat, on I forgot, the USS something or other, and they signed a surrender, and the emperor said, okay, we gave up, and the war's over, and there wasn't guerrilla resistance in Japan when MacArthur, took over the administration or whatever. The war was over, and yet, as you're saying, we're going into regime change. The people who could possibly sign a surrender, there's nobody to sign a surrender. So what? The oldest guy in each village?
Yeah, I mean, it's noticeable. Everybody, who's citing, who was in favor of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, cites, why wasn't it like Japan or Germany? One place they never mention is Italy. When the U.S. forces occupied Italy, which is a much more a country which has much weaker central government. A lot of what happened in Naples was kind of what happened in Baghdad.
Well, that's maybe history that they teach students in the United Kingdom, but that's nothing I've ever learned about. World War II. What happened in Naples?
What happened in Naples? Well, the U.S. general in command, one of his main advisors had been shipped over from New York, had jolly good contacts because he was a leading member of the mafiosi. There was corruption everywhere. It was, very much like Baghdad was half a century later.
Yeah, it's hard to occupy unorganized people. I forgot who it was. It may have even been you on this show who explained that it's really hard to take over Africa because they don't have any central governments to co-opt, or not very powerful ones. And so without the instrumentation of control already set up to co-opt, it's almost impossible to occupy what amounts to a bunch of wild land and decentralized power.
No, that's exactly so. If you're going into the invasion business, you want to invade Denmark. You don't want to invade places like Afghanistan or somewhere in Central Africa.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, so let's talk a little bit about the details of what's going on in Afghanistan here. Barack Obama's speech was so full of contradictions. We're going to escalate, and right about the time the last soldier gets off the plane, we're going to start withdrawing them again, and then of course Gates and Hillary Clinton both came out and contradicted him and said 2011, forget any of that, we're staying forever kind of thing. We're fighting Al-Qaeda, we're fighting the Taliban, whatever that is. We're fighting on the side of the Karzai government, which just stole 1.3 million votes and never had any legitimacy in the first place. What's going on here? Is there any hope for even what maybe the American administration would define as success here?
I sort of doubt it. I mean, it depends how much effort they want to put into it, If the United States wants to apply all its energies, all its money to getting control of Afghanistan for a few years, maybe they're able to do that for a short time. I don't think they'll be able to do it in the long term. But it's a rather sort of astonishing thing to try to do. One of the poorest countries in the world, one of the most violent countries in the world. Why are they doing that? I mean, my own feeling is that, why did Bush invade Afghanistan and Iraq in the first place? Well, many reasons, but was to show that the U.S. was the one superpower in the world. So, you eventually had in Afghanistan, you had a war which had sort of got too big to fail, because the same reason that they put money into AIG or various banks, that whatever the war was for, they couldn't be seen to lose it because the loss of prestige would be too great.
Right. Yeah, I've only recently, I guess, heard a phone conversation where Lyndon Johnson is explaining that I will not be the first American president to lose a war. And, of course, millions of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of Americans died after that. And that was the only thing. In fact, the rest of the audio, he's explained to the senators about how this is a no-good, no-win situation. We shouldn't even escalate in Vietnam at all. But, geez, I'd hate for Barry Goldwater to make fun of me on the campaign trail. So millions of people died. And this was the decision-making process, apparently.
Yeah, I think half the wars in history are like that. People think we're going to look real bad if I lose this one, and maybe, we send another 10,000 men, it's all going to come right, And then dribble, you put more and more resources in, and then it gets even more difficult to pull out because, you have too many dead. And people were going to say, how come, we got so many people killed? So, you get sucked into it more and more. But it's very bizarre, Obama's speech. Obviously everybody's pointing out, going in, announcing when you're going to pull out. That's kind of strange. The announcing, the key thing is, to get al-Qaeda in Afghanistan when al-Qaeda isn't in Afghanistan insofar as it exists anymore. It's in Pakistan. I think one of the more sort of threatening things is not what Obama said, but what Robert Gates said, the defense secretary, of saying, well, it doesn't really matter if it's Taliban or al-Qaeda, that they're both kind of the same thing. First of all, I think that's just ain't true. Taliban's interests are in Afghanistan. They aren't really in the rest of the world. But if you announce that basically they're the same as al-Qaeda and anybody who's friendly with them is the same as al-Qaeda, of course that gives a tremendous boost to al-Qaeda-type organizations. But I think that, otherwise it's also pretty strange, as you pointed out, announcing support for, conditional support for Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, but what happens if he just says drop dead or just doesn't do anything when you say remove this corrupt governor? He doesn't do that. Now you do one of two things. Either there's nothing, you do nothing, but you've no replacement for Karzai, or you start appointing your own governor. Now, of course, if the U.S. starts appointing their own governors, that's called occupation. And, of course, they will say, oh, it's not occupation. But a lot of Afghans will say it sure is. And that will create a backlash.
Mm. Well, there are some things could be done, which they probably won't do. For instance, this is a fantastically poor country. It's not very big, to about 25, 26 million people. About half of them are on the edge of starvation. If they use these enormous sums of money to just buy people bread, give people jobs, a lot of Afghans would feel better about it. But I somehow think they're not going to do that. Well, I want to ask you about al-Qaeda and the what's going on in the border region and all that. But, I figure as long as Gates is conflating, anyone who resists together, we ought to try to do our best to parse them all as best we can. We hear talk about the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban versus the Afghan Taliban and how they're not really the same thing. And then, on the other hand, the way the word is used in the media, you might think Taliban means anyone who resists, but then I guess that begs the question, is it only Pashtuns who dare resist the occupation? Everybody else, sees us on their side in it, or at least for now or something? And so anybody who resists is a Pashtun and therefore they're a Taliban? Or how does that work anyway?
I think the Taliban are basically Pashtun, I think one thing that strikes me about Afghanistan is that, that the military was sort of playing, the U.S. military, and to a degree the British military, were playing it up as if this was, Hitler's panzers on the Channel, next thing they'll be in Dover, that playing up the war as being of gigantic significance, and secondly, we're losing it. In Afghanistan, it's very much, an insurgency of the Pashtun community. There's 42% of the Afghans and not a majority. And the U.S. and Britain and the others are really intervening in an Afghan civil war. They're intervening against the same people who fought the Soviets. So I think that there was never, why was the Taliban able to take most of the country before 2001? Well, because they got direct assistance from the Pakistan military intelligence, and they got money from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. The Taliban takeover of Afghanistan has much more to do with warlords changing sides, as they just got a whopping a large suitcase full of money, rather than any military victories. So I don't think that the chances of the Taliban taking over the whole country were that high this year or last year. I think it's all been rather souped up by the military to justify the intervention, justify the military being basically in militarizing foreign policy, that they're going to be in charge of this. And I think that, in fact, they've to some extent manufactured the crisis in Afghanistan. Yeah, the Taliban are quite powerful, but they're not that powerful. It's mainly that the Karzai government is so weak.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this, because, they talk so much about the surge and how they're going to copy the model from the success of Iraq. But, of course, as we've discussed on this show numerous times, basically the reason that the violence decreased the degree that it did in Iraq was because the Sunnis lost the civil war, and America finally accepted their offer to stop fighting our army if we would just let them, police their own communities and pay them a little bit of money. And it seems like they're talking about the same surge and replicating the wonderful success in Afghanistan. But that would mean, wouldn't it, bribing the Taliban? It would mean not supporting the civil war against the Pashtuns. It would mean, buying up all the local Taliban leaders and calling them the Afghan Awakening and using them to, I guess, fight any Arabs left over or something like that, right? And they're not even talking about doing that.
It's not quite clear what it means, I think that the great success of the surge was really PR, it was really propaganda, The arrival of a small 28,000 extra American troops actually sort of was at the end of this sort of civil war when the Shias, as you mentioned, had beaten the Sunni. And it really was, perhaps the least important element in it. There's actually quite a good study of this, just came out under the auspices of Columbia University, giving sort of facts and figures to this thesis, saying, that the proportion of Iraqis who are Sunni is now about 12%, used to be 20%. That that most of the refugees that have fled to Syria and Jordan are Sunni. At the height of the killings there, they said they got some figures from the Baghdad morgue I hadn't seen before, that when 3,000 people were being killed every month, that three-quarters of them were Sunni. Sort of focusing on the civil war within Iraq, the outcome of which really determined the end to the insurgency against American troops, and not anything that was ordered from Washington.
Right, and as we see from the news today, it's the war against or at least the resistance against the American-installed Iraqi government has not stopped.
No, but I think that, how far is this installed by the Americans? Well, the Shia were always going to win, but I think there was also, this is a strange government which is partly sort of dances between the raindrops, getting support from the U.S. and from the Iranians. But I think that that the idea, getting back to, could the surge be replicated in Afghanistan, something that's usually said by people who haven't a clue what the surge was in Iraq. Well, one, the surge was different from what they imagined in Iraq, and second, you couldn't do the same thing in Afghanistan. I think that Petraeus is a pretty careful politician. I think he has a sense of politics, which is probably greater than his military skills, and it's noticeable that he's been sort of saying that the two are very different, and not quite being upfront of saying, like, what I did in Iraq I can do in Afghanistan.
Well, he is running for president, General Petraeus, so
sure, yeah.
That's to be expected.
So I think that, they've kind of partly manufactured this crisis or heavily publicized it. There are various things they can do, open some roads and so forth. Will it work in the long term? We'll see. But it's rather amazing that, the enormously expensive American army should be devoting itself to pursuing guys around the mountains of Afghanistan.
Well, I wonder about that, too. If Gates didn't have the Taliban there to conflate with al-Qaeda, how much of a real al-Qaeda is left? In fact, I guess more importantly, do you believe that Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri are somewhere inside those the mountainous Waziristan or northwestern federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan? Is that where their podcasts are coming from, those guys?
I haven't a clue where they are. The thing is, they've kind of, they kind of succeeded and they've kind of disappeared too. There never was a great big al-Qaeda. It was kind of small cells around the place, and most of these attacks we've had were kind of self-generated of people who sort of kind of took the franchise.
Well, if you try to define it really broadly and say, well, any Saudis or Egyptians hiding out in those mountains, that counts as Ayman al-Zawahiri's friends or something. How many people are we talking about, do you think? Or do you think there's any truth to this war against al-Qaeda in Pakistan at all?
I don't know. It's sort of, there isn't much sign of it. I mean, I think that, it's curious, it's very strange about al-Qaeda that is the reason that not just only Obama, but Gordon Brown in Britain justifies the war, sending British troops there, and it's a very unpopular war in Britain, by saying, I'm defending the streets of every British town and city and village, by sending troops to Afghanistan. But then people say, hold on a minute, nobody imagines that al-Qaeda is actually there. And there's also, seems to me, no question that it increases the danger of attacks in Britain and elsewhere, because it increases the general animosity towards the U.S. I think the most dangerous moment for al-Qaeda and similar organizations came at the end of last year, when it appeared that, I can't say it appeared that way to me, but it's to a lot of people in the Middle East that maybe they had a more sympathetic U.S. regime. But since then we've seen over Palestine, over Iraq, over Afghanistan, that there's a growing consensus that, it's really the same policy as before. If the first had been true, if there had been a real change, that would have been undermined anything that al-Qaeda wanted to do, which really, al-Qaeda is kind of small, but it floats on a great, huge sea of animosity towards the U.S. Across the Muslim world.
Well, we talked about before about how, well, I guess, the major motivation for the American policy there is just to make an example and prove, America's the big, toughest guy on the block and nobody can mess with us without having to pay the price and that kind of thing. And of course, also how our domination of that part of the world is the reason why we get attacked in the first place. But do you think that's the bottom line? Is that the real reason that we're there, is just to continue beating people up till a certain amount of time has gone by and we prove we're the toughest guy on the block? I mean, some people say, well, it's all about pipeline politics, or it's all about, checking the power of Russia and China. It's all about Caspian oil. It's all about surrounding Iran. It's all about Israel wants us to secure Pakistan's nukes because that's what they're most scared of. And everybody's got a million theories about what's going on here. My friend Gareth Porter, the great reporter, says, no, they're just fighting anyone who resists them, and that's as smart as it gets. That's as much actual strategy as there is that there are people who are resisting us, so we have to fight them, and that there's actually no real reason behind it at all. Why are we doing this?
Because initially the U.S. went in there to show, we're the big superpower or hyperpower. We don't need allies. We can take over these countries. To hell with everybody else. Then to their horror, they found not only were they not winning, but actually the reverse was happening. It was becoming a demonstration of weakness. So then they were saying, well, we can't be seen, that we've been seen off by, this kind of small Sunni community in Iraq and a bunch of Pashtun tribesmen in Afghanistan. So they have to put enormous resources into winning these which actually were originally quite small wars. I think that these other things may feed into it, of people who wanted to, had interests in oil and gas. But I don't think that was the original motive at all. I think it was small wars that went wrong.
Yeah. Well, and of course that's the best kind of small war, right? Is one that you can it keeps creating worse consequences, like say, I don't know, a few million refugees inside Pakistan. That'll, as Pakistan unravels, that'll be the excuse to expand the war next door. But we're still not talking about, coming to blows with China or something terrible like that.
Yeah,
we're still,
but failed states can do an awful lot of damage. Most people, everybody who starts a war thinks they're going to win it, the opposition in Afghanistan looked pretty puny, but it turned out that wasn't so. But if this turns out into growing confrontation with Pakistan, then there are a lot of people in Pakistan. There are nuclear weapons there. Suddenly these things get real serious, and it always seems easy at the beginning. But you look at the last since 1980, some of the worst moments for U.S. foreign policy. I was in Beirut in 82, 84, when the Marines got blown up. Then there was Somalia in the 1990s. Then we had Iraq. Now we've got Afghanistan. You know, there's a whole litany of things that look real easy the first time around and turn into real disasters.
All right, everybody, that's Patrick Cockburn. He's Middle East correspondent at The Independent. That's independent.co.uk. Go to Amazon.com and get the book Muqtada. It's Muqtada al-Sadr and the Shiite Revival in Iraq. Thanks very much for your time on the show today.
No, thank you.